Jeff Moon. He's the president of China Moon Strategies. Jeff, we keep hearing about it, but let's begin with the significance of the week that changed the world. I'd like to get your reaction and your quick reflections.
Well, it really did change the geopolitical world. It's hard to imagine 50 years ago, but we were in the middle of the Cold War. The U.S. was in a struggle with the Soviet Union. China had just had a border clash with the Soviets 2 years before, and there was a common interest, and there were other interests as well. But that common interest really lasted for the duration of the Cold War, which ended until 1989. After that, the economic relationship started to develop, and the two countries had a complementary situation where China basically had labor, the U.S. had know-how, and we could work together for quite a few years. I think that changed around the financial crisis, 2006, 2008, where China thought, well, gee, maybe we can do these things better on our own. And by the way, we'd like to compete as well. And it's been that period, that decade or so, where we've lost that sort of common interest. And that's why the relationship is going astray a bit. And that's why you've seen mixed feelings, I think, between the two governments today as we talk about the anniversary of Nixon's visit.
So, Jeff, when you consider how the U.S. and how China approached the other 50 years ago, is there anything from that time that is relevant that can be used today?
There are things. Back then, we talked a little bit about the visit and the locations where they visited. And throughout that visit, they negotiated the Shanghai Communique. At one point during the negotiations, the Americans agreed to a text and later realized that the provisions regarding Taiwan were not suitable. Zhou Enlai, realizing that was the situation, facilitated changes in the final text that would suit the political purposes of both countries. Why is that important? It's because one country was looking out not just for itself, but for the other country in order to keep things on track. And I think that we had that for the first 20 or 30 years of the relationship after Nixon came to China, but we've lost that, I think, in most recent years as things have come to a much more zero-sum relationship that is not as mutually advantageous as it could be.
So what would you say is the biggest challenge of this relationship right now, given the current geopolitical landscape? Where do things stand with trade? And is it more difficult to work on this relationship given all of that, the pandemic, not being able to see each other in person?
Well, you hit on an interesting point. You know, it occurs to me that 50 years ago, the two countries were in isolation from each other for political reasons, and yet we've come full circle. Today, we are also in isolation, though for natural reasons. And I think that isolation for the 20 years before the Nixon visit caused lots of misunderstandings and problems unnecessarily. And I think COVID is causing similar kinds of problems because people can sit at their homes or their offices and bark off statements without really having to accept the consequences or understand what the other side is thinking. So I think that is a big problem, and that leads to the trust problem that we have. The trust that both sides took 50 years ago to actually meet in Beijing and negotiate and start a relationship is just not there. And most recently, you mentioned trade. The fact that the phase one trade deal is now over and China has not delivered on a single dollar of the $200 billion. So purchases above the 2017 levels is a real problem. And so I really think that trust is the biggest problem, and we need to try to work together to overcome that and move this relationship forward.